All right, folks, I think we're going to begin. We are still experiencing the technical difficulties, so you are not going to be entertained, apparently, this evening with images that were designed to accompany this talk, but we will all live, I'm sure, nonetheless. Let's get started. I wanted to just begin by welcoming everybody, welcoming you all to the Borders and Bodies lecture series, which is co-sponsored by the Polis Project, Warscapes Magazine, and the CUNY Doctoral Students Council here at the Graduate Center. My name is Michael Busch. Among other things, I'm the senior editor at Warscapes Magazine and a member of the Polis Project Collective. Just at the outset, I wanted to just offer a couple of words of thanks. Thanks first to you all. It is a freakishly gorgeous day outside, and still, you have chosen to join us here in the fluorescent glow of the Grad Center, and so we are grateful and we thank you. And I also wanted to just take a moment to also thank our friends at the DSC, and specifically Hamad Sindi and Jeremy Randall for their exceptional generosity, their logistical help, and their moral support throughout the planning and execution of this lecture series. Without them, this event just simply wouldn't be taking place, or at least not taking place here. So thank you, wherever you are. There you are. Thank you very much. A couple of brief words, too, just about the Polis Project, so that you have a sense of sort of what it is and what we're about. We are a humanities collective, a transnational humanities collective of scholars, artists, and activists whose practice aims at having an impact beyond sort of the realms or the spheres of specialized discussions. Our interests focus chiefly on issues of violence, occupation, post-colony, self-determination, and the future trajectories of war. And our idea is that by making public interventions and opening up a public space for debate and dissent, we can nurture and cultivate intellectual, artistic, and political resistance. And God knows this is a moment where we need as much of that as possible. So based on common ideals and commitment, we've come together to produce some published research, commentary, and analysis on issues of war, conflict, militarization, and transformation of occupied spaces. This takes a number of different forms in our various activities. It can be anything from essays, debates, podcasts, or lecture series like this one, Borders and Bodies. So why Borders and Bodies? Well, the first decades of the 21st century have run, sadly, a familiar course of international crises, very akin to those of the 20th century, although these obviously take on kind of a distinct and newly troubling sort of flavor, whether it be the Mediterranean refugee crisis, the advent of ISIS, the rise of Donald Trump and the resurgence of white nationalism in the American executive, intensifying environmental degradation, the Rohingya genocide, among many others. And each of these really does, I think, throw the tension, the political tension between borders and bodies into high relief. Questions of movement, responsibility, protection, and belonging are at the heart of these concerns and drive, in many ways, the response to both man-made and natural disasters. So Bodies and Borders comprises a semester-long series of conversations examining the interplay between these two concepts, borders and bodies, through a variety of different frameworks and media, including nationalism, gender, environmental breakdown, war, and what we're going to be talking about tonight, migration and race. And so I'm especially pleased to kick off this series this semester with our guest this evening, Dr. Carl Lindskoog. Carl is assistant professor of history at Raritan Valley Community College. He's a scholar of immigration, race, and rebellion, and he's the author of Detain and Punish, Haitian Refugees and the Rise of the World's Largest Immigration Detention System, which is forthcoming from the University of Florida Press. The book offers the first, I think, in-depth history of immigration detention in the United States and really puts Haitian refugees at the center of the action and the center of the narrative. And it's going to be the basis of his lecture tonight. So you didn't come here to hear me speak. And so without further ado, I'd like to present Dr. Carl Lindskoog. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. So thanks to the Polis Project, Warscapes Magazine, the Doctoral Students Council, and Michael especially for inviting me. Just want to add, in addition, that we've, I think, agreed that Warscapes Magazine is going to publish an excerpt of this as the publication date gets closer, and also will help distribute a discount code for the book for people who might be interested in purchasing it, but not at the ridiculous rate that they're going to sell the hardcover. So I'm thrilled to be here. But at the same time, I'm terribly sorry that this book which is a work of history, albeit recent history, that this book speaks so directly to our current society, because that means that we're still dealing with the problems that were created at least 40 years ago. In fact, the problem is getting worse. So the United States, you might know, incarcerates more than 400,000 people every year for immigration-related violations. This is the largest immigration detention system in the world. On any given day, tens of thousands of immigrant detainees, including asylum seekers, families, children, are locked up in the United States' vast network of more than 200 detention facilities. More than half of these detention facilities are privately owned, with virtually no regulation or oversight. And the cost of this immense detention effort was $2.3 billion in 2016, which is the last time we have pretty good numbers for it. In fact, the immigration detention system in the United States has grown so large that the number of individuals incarcerated in the federal penal system for immigration-related offenses has now surpassed the number of prisoners locked up for drug-related crimes. In the most incarcerated nation in the world, immigrant detainees are now the largest proportion of federal prisoners. According to historian Tori Hester, immigration control and the war on drugs now stand as the dual cornerstones of the carceral state. So how did we get here? When did mass detention become a centerpiece of the United States immigration policy? How did the imprisonment of immigrants become a cornerstone of our carceral state? And how, for that matter, did our world become a place that imprisons and banishes those who dare to cross borders without permission? And what do Haiti and Haitians have to do with any of this? Well, to answer these questions, we have to go back to the 1970s, actually earlier. The current immigration detention system has only formally been in place since 1981. But immigration detention does have a much longer history in the United States, you might know. In the early 20th century, Chinese immigrants in particular were subject to detention in the West Coast immigration station of Angel Island. Migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border were often detained by Border Patrol officials. On the East Coast, European immigrants were sometimes detained at Ellis Island. In fact, prior to 1954, it was U.S. policy to detain almost all those seeking to enter the United States until a determination could be made on their status. But in 1954, the government formally ended its policy of detention, replacing it with a policy of what it called parole. And although limited detention continued in certain places in the post-1954 period, especially along the U.S.-Mexico border for short-term detention, after 1954, immigration detention ceased to be a formal part of U.S. immigration policy. The physical detention of aliens is now the exception, declared Supreme Court Justice Tom C. Clark in 1958. Certainly, this policy reflects humane qualities of an enlightened civilization, he said then. So what caused U.S. officials to reinstitute detention as immigration policy, placing the United States on the path where it's now become the behemoth that it is today? In December 1972, Yvonne Bruno, a barge operator from Port-au-Prince who had escaped a prison in Haiti, and 64 other Haitians launched out on a treacherous 3-week sea voyage that brought their vessel first to Cuba, then the Bahamas, and finally to the shores of Florida. Bruno and his compatriots sought asylum in the United States. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new phase in Haitian migration to the U.S., a phase that would see increasing numbers of Haitians traveling by boat to U.S. shores in order to seek asylum, fleeing a despotic regime, the Duvalier dictatorship, that inflicted both political and economic violence on its people. The U.S. government's response to this group arriving in December 1972 was indicative of what was to come. Each of the 42 men, 20 women, and 3 children that made up this group of so-called boat people was ultimately denied asylum. Now, despite substantial evidence that many of those fleeing for the United States in the 1970s had a well-founded fear of persecution, American officials, driven by a combination of international and local political interests, immediately adopted a policy of denying asylum to all Haitians, which they justified by claiming Haitians were economic migrants rather than political refugees. To discourage unwanted Haitian refugees from coming to the United States, the U.S. government introduced a series of reinforcing practices to buttress its policy of denial for Haitian asylum seekers. These practices included detention in local and state jails and prisons. If they were released after posting bond, the Haitians were denied work permits, and once apprehended, they were immediately processed for exclusion or deportation. Immigration and State Department officials hoped that these harsh policies toward Haitians would deter future refugees from Haiti and other parts of Latin America from seeking asylum on U.S. shores. As a result, from the arrival of some of the very first Haitian boat people, the U.S. government employed a program of detention and curtailed due process to discourage Haitians and other refugees from coming to the United States. So far from being merely an administrative tool to be used while processing these unauthorized migrants, detention was utilized from the very beginning as part of a harsh set of practices meant to deter immigration through punishment. As soon as U.S. officials began their program of deterrence through detention, the already established Haitian community in the United States, based primarily in New York and South Florida, began their own program of resistance. This included and incorporated those who are detained and in the prisons and jails themselves. An important part of this campaign for resistance worked through the law. Through legal challenges, detainees and their advocates forced the government several times in the 1970s to stop their practice of imprisoning Haitian asylum seekers and to give them due process in the courts, which the courts said they were entitled to. But each time, the Carter administration found ways to circumvent the court rulings and reinstitute its exclusionary practices towards Haitians. Now, what's important to note here is that as early as the mid-1970s, the U.S. government was already clearing the way for the return of immigration detention through its treatment of Haitian refugees. But it was the refugee crisis of 1980 that drove government officials even further to forging the detention tool as a key thing used in immigration regulation. So what happens in 1980? In April, Cuban President Fidel Castro submitted to pressure from those clamoring to leave Cuba, announcing his government would allow the exit of those wanting to leave, and Cuban Americans in South Florida began sailing to the port of Mariel to bring thousands of their compatriots to the United States. This began what was known as the Mariel Boat Lift, a period of mass emigration from Cuba that stretched from April to October and brought nearly 125,000 Cuban Marielitos to the United States in search of asylum. The mass influx of Cubans occurred just as tens of thousands of Haitians fleeing a deteriorating human rights situation in their country were also sailing for the United States in order to seek asylum. Approximately 15,000 Haitian asylum seekers joined the more than 100,000 Cubans, all arriving in a few months, placing the United States in its unprecedented position of becoming a country of mass first asylum for the first time in its history, and presenting the Carter administration with a refugee crisis for which it was totally unprepared. At the height of the Mariel boat lift, Cubans and Haitians were both detained pending processing. But because the Cubans were considered bona fide refugees, they were mostly processed and released, while the continuing influx of Haitians occupied a larger and larger part of the U.S. government's growing detention apparatus. And then, when the administration of Ronald Reagan came to power in 1981, the Cuban element of the refugee crisis had mostly subsided while the Haitian exodus continued. In response, and building upon the Carter administration's already established Haitian detention policy, Reagan administration officials took the next critical step. In May 1981, the Reagan administration began detaining all undocumented Haitians without the possibility of bond. And with this launching of the mandatory detention program for all unauthorized Haitians, the Reagan administration formally revived the practice of immigration detention that had lain dormant for more than 2 decades and had only recently started to reemerge under the Carter administration and in the Caribbean refugee crisis. Now, I want to be very clear, at the moment of detention's rebirth, it was a Haitian-only policy. A memo prepared for the President's Chief of Staff, James Baker, acknowledged as much. Quote, as part of the administration's immigration policy, a decision was made to detain aliens arriving illegally on our shores and borders. The continued arrival of Haitians drives our current policy, close quote. But still, even if you see these documents, as I have in the presidential archives, it still seems incredible that it was the Reagan administration's response to the influx of Haitian refugees, a group that constituted less than 2% of all illegal entrants to the United States, that reversed 27 years of policy and revived the practice of detention. Why then institute such a controversial and costly project for such admittedly limited ends? Ask Norman L. Zucker and Naomi Flink Zucker. Well, one answer is that the Haitian detention policy might be seen as intended not just for Haitians, but for all would-be asylum seekers. According to Zucker and Zucker, the policy of Haitian detention was not to reduce the number of illegal entries, but rather to reduce the number of individuals asking for asylum. Since the Reagan administration was determined not to expand the asylum apparatus, it would need to find a way to discourage asylum seekers, a project it initiated by targeting Haitians. And so Haiti would be the test case, Michael J. Churgan observes, in employing detention and interdiction as an experiment in deterrence. In his study of the U.S.-Mexico border, Peter Andreas argues that border policing is less about achieving the stated instrumental goal of deterring illegal border crossers and more about politically recrafting the image of the border and symbolically reaffirming the state's territorial authority by projecting the appearance of a more secure and orderly border. This was as true for Haitians along the border of South Florida as it was for Mexicans and other Latin American migrants along the U.S.-Mexico divide. The detention of Haitian asylum seekers proved useful then to an administration that was looking for ways to reassert its sovereignty in the wake of the refugee crisis of 1980 and thinking far beyond Haiti and its refugees and what it was doing. If the Reagan administration was clear that the new detention system was being created for Haitians, critics of the Reagan administration, too, recognized that Haitians were being singled out for detention. Arthur C. Helton, director of the Political Asylum Project for the Lawyers' Committee for International Human Rights, in testimony before Congress, responded to the question of how the administration should proceed with its detention program. Quote, based on our experience with and observation of the Haitians, we strongly oppose the administration's unprecedented policy of prolonged mass detention of asylum applicants. We submit that this is not an experience that our country ought to spend additional money to replicate. Well, despite these warnings, the Reagan administration did replicate its Haitian program. In fact, where Arthur Helton might have seen a dangerous precedent, some administration officials saw opportunity. As one internal memo recognized, the administration was laying the groundwork for a detention system that could absorb many more groups in the future. A report prepared for the president's chief of staff had this to say, quote, alien detention requirements are not expected to diminish in the future. Regardless of the Haitian population, further influxes of illegal aliens can be expected, and this administration should be prepared to deal with its future detention requirements. And it was prepared. 1 year after the Reagan administration had initiated its policy of mandatory detention for Haitians, it broadened the policy to mandate imprisonment for all refugees lacking authorization to enter the country. Soon, thousands of Salvadorans and Guatemalans fleeing Reagan administration-backed violence in Central America would join the Haitians in a growing network of immigrant prisons. The rebirth of immigration detention, which had been originally devised to apply only to Haitians, was next applied to other asylum seekers from Latin America and later to people from all around the world. What's interesting is it was another legal challenge by Haitian detainees and their advocates that actually led the Reagan administration to expand its detention policy to include all unauthorized migrants. Haitian plaintiffs argued that the detention policy was illegal in part because in implementing the new policy, the government had not complied with the Administrative Procedures Act that required public notification and a period of public comment on the new rule. The plaintiffs also held that the detention program, since it applied to Haitians alone, was discriminatory and thus illegal. So, in order to meet its requirements under the APA and to nullify the court's ability to block the government's detention program on the grounds of discrimination, the Reagan administration publicly announced that it was expanding the policy of mandatory detention to include all inadmissible aliens. In a July 1982 interim rule that announced the expanded detention policy, the government declared that, quote, aliens who appear to be inadmissible and who have false or no documentation and or who arrive at places other than designated ports of entry will be detained by the Immigration and Naturalization Service under Section 235B of the Immigration and Naturalization Act. This provided the legal basis for the dramatic expansion of the immigration detention system that would follow. Over the protests of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and other groups, which argued that the rule violated the Refugee Act of 1980, the United Nations Protocol on the Status of Refugees, the INS still issued its final rule on October 1982, and the blanket detention policy was thus formalized. As the 1980s progressed, a growing number of those in detention were refugees, as we said, from Central America, fleeing the bloody civil wars and activities of U.S.-backed death squads in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. And the INS responded to the influx of Central American refugees by increasingly focusing its detention policy along the U.S.-Mexico border to catch those asylum seekers it labeled OTMs, or other than Mexicans. And as the number of Central American refugees in detention grew, Salvadorans and their advocates would join Haitians at key stages in the campaign for freedom, asylum, and the end of detention. The number of INS detention facilities and the agency's overall capacity grew dramatically throughout the 1980s. By October 1985, the INS detention facilities were holding 2,200 to 2,300 prisoners on any given day, which sounds, from our current vantage point, like not very many, but it was a dramatic growth from just a few years earlier. By 1986, the number of INS-owned and operated detention facilities had grown from 5 to 7, and the government was holding immigrant detainees in more than 1,000 additional non-service detention facilities, including federal prisons and state and local jails. The U.S. Committee for Refugees reported at that time that the number of aliens in INS detention had grown to 3,025 and now included Afghans, Iranians, Salvadorans, as well as Haitians and Cubans. And INS-operated detention centers, jails, and federal prisons were not the only institutions holding immigrant detainees in the 1980s. From 1984 onward, privately owned and operated for-profit detention centers made up an increasingly important part of the government's detention network. And although they're ubiquitous today, you might not know that the United States' first private prisons were immigration detention facilities. In 1983, the Reagan administration, which was desperate for detention space to relieve overcrowding in INS facilities and federal prisons, offered a contract to the recently founded Corrections Corporation of America, an organization that would go on to become the largest private prison company in the country. And now it's changed its name. It's called CoreCivic now. And the number of private immigration prisons rose rapidly over the next 6 years, with the growth of private detention facilities mirroring the growth of INS-operated facilities. As the United States reinstituted detention program moved into its second decade, it continued to grow. And then in 1991, another crisis in the Caribbean would again force tens of thousands of Haitians to seek asylum on American shores, opening up yet a whole nother new chapter in the history of immigration detention. On September 19, 1991, members of the Haitian military staged a coup d'etat, forcing the democratically elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, to leave the country. The next target of the military were the activists and organizations that made up Haiti's popular movement. Military and paramilitary forces murdered hundreds in the first days of the coup. Numerous sources claimed that the number of dead soon exceeded 1,500. Death squads carried out campaigns of terror, torturing and mutilating their victims. They used rape against women. And in the face of all this violence, tens of thousands of Haitians fled their country, some of them launching out by boat to seek refuge in the United States. The U.S. government, for their part, blocked their escape with U.S. Coast Guard cutters, but they were uncertain about what to do with the growing number of Haitians in their custody. Bush administration's officials initially opted to detain them on board the Coast Guard vessels, while they tried to persuade other neighboring Caribbean nations to accept Haitian refugees. But by mid-November, as the number of refugees fleeing Haiti multiplied, the government's practice of detention at sea, as it were, became unsustainable. Having failed to persuade Haiti's neighbors to accept a substantial number of refugees and remaining unwilling to grant the Haitians temporary protected status or to allow them to enter the U.S., the Bush administration chose to begin returning the refugees to Haiti. On November 18, 538 of the Haitian refugees were forcibly returned to a Haiti that remained in the violent grip of the coup regime, a move that was met with scorn and outrage by international observers and human rights advocates. But one day after the U.S. government began returning refugees to Haiti, attorneys for the Haitian Refugee Center filed a complaint in court against the repatriation of the Haitians, and it sought and received a temporary restraining order against the action. Now the U.S. government was stymied by the lawsuit and the court order, and so it attempted to resolve its Haitian refugee problem another way. Instead of mass detention on board Coast Guard vessels, the Haitians would be detained at the nearby U.S. naval base of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Transfers to Guantanamo began immediately. The establishment of the Haitian refugee camp at Guantanamo Bay, like other elaborations of the detention regime before it, was thus the government's response to legal resistance by the Haitian refugees and their advocates, as well as the U.S.'s attempts to circumvent the law and to ignore their legal obligations to asylum seekers. The naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, controlled by the United States but outside of U.S. territory, was the ideal space to implement what some had long called for, an extraterritorial detention facility that could act as a buffer between the United States and those nearby nations that were sending migrants to American shores. According to Michael Ratner, attorney for the soon-to-be detained Haitian refugees, the government was well aware that Guantanamo's appeal would allow it to serve as an attractive location for a new refugee base because of its inaccessibility, would prevent news reporters and others from scrutinizing the treatment of the Haitians. What's more, the government could argue that the refugees would have no legal rights in Guantanamo, and so it could claim that the United States Constitution did not protect foreign nationals outside the country and that refugees could not apply for the protection of political asylum until they actually set foot in the United States. Of course, we know detention facilities at Guantanamo have attracted worldwide attention and controversy in the years following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, when the George W. Bush administration began using the naval base in southeastern Cuba to hold so-called enemy combatants captured in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere in the far-reaching and ever-expanding war on terror. In this post-9/11 moment, scholars like Amy Kaplan observed that Guantanamo's extraterritoriality not only placed it beyond the reach of U.S. law and accountability, it also established the site as one island in a global penal archipelago where the United States indefinitely detains, secretly transports, and tortures uncounted prisoners from around the world. It is the extraterritorial nature of the United States' global network of black sites and prisons that is the essential characteristic that has enabled these practices, which are illegal within the border of the United States, to continue. But even before Guantanamo became a controversial extraterritorial prison in the war on terror, it was used a decade earlier to detain Haitian refugees, a staging point, as Jana Evans Brazil notes, in an earlier war on refugees. Indeed, Haitians were the original Guantanamo detainees. And so the government's expansion of the Haitian detention program would have far-reaching consequences. The United States now had an offshore detention camp for unauthorized migrants, and in the aftermath of 9/11, enemy combatants, for whom the government continued to acknowledge few rights based on their extraterritorial detention. So I want to say quickly, there are other important developments in the history of immigration detention in the late 1990s that I'm not going to talk about, because now in my last few minutes I want to talk about some of what I think are important conclusions of this history. As the United States expanded its detention regime in the first decade of the 21st century, the world followed its lead. When the United States launched its Haitian detention policy in the 1970s and then formally reinstituted its detention program in 1981, immigration detention was then seen as a special state muscle to be exercised only in exceptional times, observe Amy Nethery and Stephanie J. Silverman. Although it was used by few states before the turn of the century, however, today nearly every state around the world has adopted immigration detention and practice in some form. Nethery and Silverman claim, for example, while the detention system in the United States has grown by 75% since 2003, to the current point where it holds, as I said, more than 400,000 prisoners annually, in these same years, immigration detention has been adopted across the European Union, with detention in EU member states exceeding 570,000 in 2011. By 2014, the UK had grown its detention capacity to approximately 29,000, and Australia was detaining approximately 8,400 annually. Immigration detention policies have become more expansive and oppressive in the Netherlands, France, Finland, Turkey, South Africa, Israel, Canada, and elsewhere. From a rarely used international practice in 2000, immigration detention has grown and developed to reach its now ubiquitous status. And along with the global rise of detention practices that aim to contain those who transgress borders, there's also a growing practice of extraterritorial detention to contain unwanted migrants before they even reach their destination country. This effort often involves wealthy nations funding detention programs in poorer neighboring countries, so the poorer countries will act as a barrier, blocking migrants and would-be asylum seekers from the wealthier countries' land and resources. In this way, the European has funded detention centers in Ukraine and in many other states along its border. Australia funds detention centers in Nauru, Papua New Guinea, and Indonesia, and the United States finances detention centers in Mexico and Guatemala. But the United States is more than merely a participant in the now global practice of extraterritorial detention. It is responsible for originating this practice. Just as it did with the practice of punitive detention as deterrent, the United States pioneered the model of practice of extraterritorial detention. More than 2 decades before it had become a common global practice for states to interdict and detain migrants before they could reach their destination, the United States government introduced its Haitian interdiction policy. Furthermore, the United States Haitian detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, provided the model on which the now widespread practice of extraterritorial detention is based. According to Azeda Dastiari, the United States detention of refugees and asylum seekers in the U.S. naval base in Cuba provided the blueprint for Australia's so-called Pacific solution, whereby it detains asylum seekers on Nauru and Papua New Guinea's Manu Islands before they can reach Australian shores. Moreover, the transfer of immigration detention facilities from wealthy nations that lie close to concentrations of capital to poor nations on the margin of the global economy is but one manifestation of a much larger neoliberal transformation. By the second decade of the 21st century, global inequality had reached record levels, with the richest 1% of the world's population having accumulated more wealth than the entire rest of the world combined. This extreme inequality is the culmination of decades of corporate globalization, driven by neoliberal practices that prioritize privatization and increased capital mobility. The increasing imbalance of wealth and the economic shifts that accompany corporate globalization also set in motion new phases of global migration, driving displaced people from the global periphery to the centers of capital. In response, this might sound familiar, wealthy nations are fortifying their borders. And they did so because they realized that if they wanted to preserve the highly unequal distribution of wealth and resources, they needed to restrict migrant mobility. As Aristide Zolberg explains, greater mobility for migrants from poor regions would result in an equalization of conditions and hence produce a vast redistribution of income to the benefit of the populations of the poorer countries. In effect, Zolberg continues, borders serve to prevent labor from commanding the same price everywhere, and also prevent people from poorer countries from gaining access to what we might call the bundles of public goods dispensed by the more affluent states, which now constitute an important part of their population's incomes. The threat of migrants triggering a redistribution of wealth and resources from the wealthy to the poor, along with the challenge to state sovereignty that large-scale migration poses, has led to the proliferation of new border walls in every corner of the world, and even within nations in the form of gated communities. Peter Andreas observes that the embrace of border walls and enforcement has been most pronounced along the geographic fault lines that divide rich nations and poor nations, particularly the southern border of the United States and the eastern and southern external borders of the European Union. The global proliferation of the new border enforcement mechanisms and the simultaneous rise of immigration detention around the world can help us see that constructing border walls, criminalizing immigration and immigrants, removing unauthorized migrants through campaigns of mass deportation, and holding immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in detention within or outside of their boundaries are all mutually reinforcing practices that serve the same function: to preserve global inequality. As Jenna Lloyd and Matt Mitchelson and Andrew Burridge observe, both walls and cages are fundamental to managing the wealth, social inequalities, and opposition to the harms created by capitalism and the present round of neocolonial dispossession. Any collective effort to reckon with the global rise of immigration detention must acknowledge that state policies that punish unauthorized migrants are much more about wealth and inequality, or I should say, are as much about wealth and inequality as they are expressions of nativism or the desire to assert state sovereignty. More than 3 decades ago, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees called upon the world to recognize that, quote, next to life itself, liberty of the person and freedom of movement are among the most precious of human rights. These words still reverberate, and for those who believe that states must not detain and punish those who cross borders without permission, they remain a call to action. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we wanted to give all of ourselves the opportunity to actually have a conversation about all of this. So we are going to sort of open the floor for everybody and anybody who has a question for anything that Carl presented or other aspects that might be related to this topic. We'd love to sort of kick things off. In order to get the ball rolling, I thought that I would just begin by asking 1 or 2 questions. But as soon as you feel prepared, if again the spirit moves, just sort of signal, and then I'll turn the floor over to you as quickly as possible. I wanted to start though, Carl. One of the things that you have in the book is kind of this, I think, if I'm reading it right, a paradox around the issue of legal challenge to some of the aspects of this regime. And you note that on the one hand, legal challenges in the courts have actually been very, very successful for those that are challenging sort of the power of the state. But on the other hand, the response is kind of a strengthening of the regime. And so I guess I'm wondering if you can, A, kind of elaborate on that a little bit, and B, talk about the extent to which that's affected kind of the activist and the legal push in response to a strengthening immigration detention system in the United States.
Yeah, it's a puzzle. It's a tough challenge because on the one hand, as you're suggesting, the legal challenge, which never exists independently of resistance on the ground and organization and mobilization by the community and all the politics, high and low politics that are involved. But legal challenge has been the most important tool that detained people and refugees and asylum seekers have had, and it's the most effective thing that has inhibited the state's ability just to do whatever it wants, to detain and to disappear, unauthorized migrants. At the same time, and there's a lot, obviously I elaborate this a lot more in the book, I just mentioned a few examples here. Every time there's been a successful challenge to the detention policy, and it's been in successive administrations crossing partisan lines. They've found ways to circumvent the law, to implement new policies. The thing that led to the expansion of the policy into one that included all was just a sneaky way to get around its violation of the Constitution and a particular bureaucratic procedure, and it had devastating consequences. There's another part that I didn't talk about here that talks about some more successful legal challenges and that have lasting consequences and have somewhat limited the state's ability to do whatever they want to detain people, but it has not, as obviously is the case, successfully stemmed the growth of this system or its brutality. So I don't quite know. I don't know if there is a solution to that. It seems to be a puzzle whereby, the state wields the law. It's not the only one who uses the law, obviously, but like the law is often used by the state to do these repressive and terrible things, and it also has the ability to ignore the law when it tries to inhibit or go around the law. So that's something I'm grappling with, but I think it's an unresolved problem in my mind about how we as activists might use the law, and it might not be a very satisfactory response. So it's a puzzle.
Please.
I mean, I would just say in response to that, I think you kind of hit on it by saying it always is the legal strategy always has to be with other strategies, right? It can't exist alone.
Right.
And then there also, there has to be those other strategies have to be strong enough, and they have to be not diverted by, for example, I'm sure you've seen Michael Ratner's article about the particular struggle of the group of Haitians at a particular moment and how they went on hunger strike, right? So their agencies, that's another piece of it, right? The agency of the people who are detained is a big piece of that resistance, right? They went on hunger strike, they changed the whole thing, right? So they, there was legal strategy, there was all this stuff going on, and then they went on hunger strike, and all of a sudden the reporters had to come around, and and the lawyers had to come around, and everybody, like, being in this situation of utter powerlessness, they had the power to make everybody move around them. And eventually, it was a long struggle, but eventually they did manage to get out, right? So that was victorious in that particular campaign. But that article is, I think, one of the best dissections I've ever seen of the campaign and how it worked. And one of the things he talks about is the kind of partisan bullshit that happened, where you had under, what year was? Oh, right. So this was right around the time of Clinton getting elected, right? So it was under Bush. You had all the Black Congressional
caucus,
and they were like doing hunger strikes against the these policies, and they're like standing up for that. And then as soon as Clinton was in office, nothing, not a word, right? So when people are sucked into these kinds of games, and then they're not really in solidarity, and they're not really doing the work, then that's a problem. So, but I think that that article is a really good dissection that it's very readable too. I would recommend it for anybody, and it's online for free. You can just read it about how that campaign led. I think it's a good intersection of legal, and because he isn't just talking about the legal strategy, he's talking about all of it, and how it fits together.
Yeah, I agree. And people like Michael Ratner and Ira Kurzban and all the other lesser known lawyers and people who were sort of engaged in this legal, political, grassroots struggle have thought a lot about the sort of broad politics and the place of legal resistance within the broader political struggle, and I've learned a lot from that. But I think they themselves in their writing, and probably in this article, right, they grapple with the limitations of the law and with how effectively they can inhibit the power of the state, but then they recognize they did close Guantanamo, at least for that section, for the Haitian period, but then it remains this thing, and it was reconstituted after 9/11, so, yeah.
And there's also the sort of mass mobilization of the Haitian communities, which I think cannot be underestimated, right, in terms of changing policy at various times. How many thousands marched over the Brooklyn Bridge back in, I'm really bad at remembering years, but, there's real agency in communities, both people in detention and the communities on the outside, and real sort of solidarity.
Definitely. Thanks.
Am I right that another side of this is, in the U.S. anyway, at least a general policy in which legal refugees are allowed in from more or less leftist regimes, and therefore the ones who come are either right-wing politicos or wealthy people. and the ones that aren't allowed are from rightist regimes, and that means the people who come tend to be the poor. Is that
Right.
more or less right?
So there, it doesn't always directly correlate with the socioeconomic status of who's coming from where, but definitely geopolitics has a huge influence. It was a major part of like why the United States was so hospitable to Cuban refugees and turning their back on Haitians, especially during the Duvalier years, while Duvalier was a reliable anti-communist ally in the Caribbean. So that the Refugee Act of 1980 was supposed to correct that long-standing problem of politics in terms of asylum seekers and refugees, but it didn't. And so yes, that's part of it, right? It's also something that's sometimes overlooked is the politics on the ground, right? Like, I didn't really talk about this so much because I only had limited time, but a big part of the question of why Haitians is the politics in Florida at this particular moment where there's sort of like rising nativism and resurgent, racism and this sort of post-civil rights moment, and just like the local congressional people and even like more local municipal level just put a lot of pressure on Congress and their local INS district director and say like, we don't want poor black people here. Do something about this. And so it's sort of like a piecemeal policy that's just designed to satisfy racist South Florida people for a while who don't want, it's not just racist either, they don't want poor, non-English speaking, culturally different refugees. But when that combines with the sort of geopolitics at the State Department level and other factors, it had this result for Haitians and not for others.
So, two quick questions. I was wondering how the Vietnamese boat people kind of compare to the Haitians. And then I'm curious about, so after the program was expanded, what countries were people from that actually won asylum as opposed to Haitians who were detained and sent back?
I'm not sure I know the answer to your second question.
Okay.
Maybe someone else here could speak to that. Regarding the Vietnamese, so it's interesting especially to see what the government says about how, what the world or the United States should be doing towards Vietnamese boat people, because of course, the United States was not the country of mass first asylum for the Vietnamese. Many of them would come eventually and they were allowed to come. Geopolitics enters into that because they're then fleeing a communist regime once the Vietnam War is coming to an end. So they are allowed to enter. But even before that, the United States is condemning Vietnam's neighbors for excluding those poor refugees and putting them in detention camps, even while it's doing the same things to Haitians, right? But so the United States is more charitable and its doors are much more open to Vietnamese refugees, although many Americans don't like that, and there's this sort of like, this same sort of like nativist, xenophobic, racist element that contributes to this toxic stew at the time, and it's sort of focused in different parts of the country. But at the government level, they're more open, and it has a lot to do with, I think, two things: that they're not the first country of mass first asylum for the Vietnamese, and they're fleeing a regime that now the United States is opposed to, basically. Does anyone else know the answer to Russell's second question about who's more favorably treated in terms of asylum seekers in the, later 80s and 90s?
Well, there's the whole issue with the Central Americans that you sort of alluded to, right? So that the people fleeing Guatemala and El Salvador were routinely denied asylum, whereas people, coming from Nicaragua,
that's true.
Were granted this, and there were fewer people coming from Nicaragua.
Right.
So it was, there was very political, and there was a big lawsuit around that, and that dragged on for years, and eventually they won sort of some duration of their asylum after many years after the fact, and then it ended up, it's a complicated political thing, but the asylum system, despite, as you said, despite the 1980 law being supposed to correct the political bias in the system, it didn't. And there's a really interesting book about it doesn't really address the political thing, but about the system. So the system now, the asylum system now is, I think, a little more professionalized and less politicized. It doesn't mean it's not politicized, but there's some really interesting research that's been done on the different kinds of bias that happen, both on the part of the judges and the administrative there's two different processes. Anyway, complicated.
Now the big winners are asylum seekers from Norway.
No one wants to come from Norway, but if they did, they would be very welcome.
How much time, on average, would people spend in detention waiting for asylum or to be kicked out?
I don't know the average time, but I know Haitians spent on, compared to other asylum seekers, much more time in detention, and that was mostly because they were part of this like network that was, participating in such strong legal resistance, right? So if you have a case that's being, pending or it's in the process of being adjudicated, like it's, they're not allowed to deport you, and sometimes that still happens, but like it was mostly their legal resistance and that they had so many community and legal advocates that sort of ironically it kept them in detention for so long. And even, in the internal documents of the Reagan administration, they talk about that, and they're like, they have their reasons for selecting Haitians from the beginning, but they recognize that, like, they keep having this Haitian problem because, they're so good at using the courts, right? And even there's this crazy document I found where one of the Reagan administration's advisors or staff members said, you should do what we did to break up and defeat the I think it was the welfare rights movement in California before you came to the presidency. And that is like defeat it with all the due process in the world, right? Like, so really like make it accessible, but just like speed them through the system, right? Like don't let them tie up the system. And I don't know that much about that history, but they were saying like we defeated poor Americans here by like sort of turning the tables on the system, and we could do the same thing to the, Haitians mainly here. Yes.
I can't speak to how long Haitians were detained or the numbers in the 80s, but I was doing a lot of research on detention now, and because of the backlog in the asylum process, it can be up to 2.5 years for your first interview, and then up to 7 years to be fully processed because of both the backlog in asylum officers under USCIS processing and the immigration courts as well, which are both really chronically underfunded. And so a lot of the time when people flee to the United States and they might have family in their home country who they think they'll be able to bring at a sooner date, are stuck in these legal proceedings for years and years. I think those numbers are 2016, and so the backlogs have gotten worse since then too. Yeah,
and the Trump administration, by the way, you probably heard, is trying to, get many more funding for many more immigration judges, so it can sort of do what the Reagan administration hoped to do, which is just speed people through and affect mass deportation.
Yeah, it's so interesting, everything you were talking about, and it's amazing to me how many different strands come into this, like especially like how you link, immigrant detention to this larger neoliberal project. And I think even if it started with nativism and racism in South Florida, it kind of becomes part of like the logic of capital in recent decades, and I think that's really critical and important. But I also think it's just very important to, as you're doing here, historicize this immigration detention system, because I think a lot of people would probably be surprised now to learn that had a starting point and that there was this kind of interregnum of decades where that wasn't happening. I think Trump supporters, of course, but probably most Obama supporters would just think, well, what else are you going to do? I mean, they're here, you put them in a prison. Well, I mean, that's
right.
That's the way. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about it from two sides. First, like prior to 81, or whenever it became kind of official, what usually was the practice? Were people deported? Did they just not enforce as much? I mean, I'm sure it was a grab bag. And then also, like the harder question, I guess, how would you recommend in this moment, like what's a good way to reframe this conversation? I mean, open borders, I think a lot of people might be in favor of that, but I mean, even not necessarily that, but just to give people a sense today of this regime is relatively recent, it's been around 30 whatever years. It's not the only way to do things. What's using history or is there some other model? Like, way to talk about how to deal with the reality of transnational movement that's not going to stop globally anytime soon. So I guess like the before 81 and then kind of how you would recommend thinking about things today.
Yeah, so before 81, and really like for the Haitians before like the 1970s, yeah, it was called a policy of parole, but basically it just meant, like, you check in if you actually enter through a inspection station or an immigrant, then, you get a notice to return if they want to check your status. And, if you're not, unless you are deemed to be a threat to public health or national security or a flight risk, and I'm not sure how they determine that, it's like that it's a civil, at most, immigration is a civil violation, not criminal, right? And so I think it was thought that, that if it's a civil violation, it's not that serious, and, why use the tool of incarceration to do anything with this. Migration patterns change a lot in the 1980s. So to talk about before and after, we'd have to acknowledge that. And there's, and for anxious white Americans, that's a big part of why they support, stronger, immigration scholars call it like crimmigration, which is like the combination of criminal justice and immigration enforcement. These things really come together, and not just in immigration detention, but in sort of policing and like all these harsh policies. So I think it's part of a larger conversation about moving away from harsh policing and the sort of law and order and just like all these punitive policies, and talking about what life was like in the United States far beyond immigration detention, what it was like before the 1970s, when that process of mass incarceration and sort of harsher policing and all these things really started. I talk in the book about the broader context of, the rise of the carceral state and how it has to do with politics and race and like all these broader things at this time. Yeah, so we need to have that conversation desperately, and I think the people who are working on mass incarceration are doing a pretty good job, at least helping us envision a world and the time before mass incarceration became a thing. But even that's part of a much broader conversation, I think, about life before the 1970s. Not that it was so idyllic for many people, but at least it was before like there was this sort of serious push towards law and order, and mass incarceration had its roots and that sort of thing.
There was a hand in front.
And there was one over here too. Yeah.
This is on a completely different topic, but you mentioned it briefly, but I was interested in maybe talk a little bit more about the difference in policy when it comes to refugees and migrants, because there's a distinction, but sometimes it feels like people just kind of lump them together.
Yeah.
Was there a difference for Haitians or just?
Well, yeah, I mean, although the detention regime ends up treating them both the same, they're not supposed to according to international law, and the United States is supposed to abide by these international laws, the most important one, which was established in 1951, and there's been subsequent articulations of this. So, if you're an unauthorized migrant, you have certain rights, but not that many. But if you come here and you claim asylum, then there's supposed to be a whole process that, you're entitled to due process, and there's international protection, because after World War II, there seemed like a global consensus, more or less, that, we can't let this happen again, that like countries will turn away, desperate people and send them back to their deaths. So the law treats them very differently, and it depends mostly on whether they want to claim asylum. That's asylum seekers are people who arrive here and then want to claim asylum, and refugees sort of establish their status before they come. Refugees and asylum seekers have much more protection than just migrants or unauthorized migrants. In practice, though, and this is part of the tragedy of the story and why this is such a big problem. Increasingly, this is part of the story of detention. The United States has ignored those its legal obligations and the distinction between asylum seekers or refugees and unauthorized migrants. And it's, treats them same in detention and lots of other ways. If in effect ignores and doesn't give you due process to claim asylum, then you're treating them just like any other unauthorized migrant. Does that answer your question? Okay. Did you have a hand up?
Yes, hi. Your paper sheds a lot of light on the detention system. I wanted to know what did you research about this infamous place, Chrome detention system? How it originates? Was it a military base before? Chrome is like hell down in southern Florida, and I just want to know if you research about it.
Yeah, definitely. So, and that's another thing I wish I could have talked about, but I'm glad you asked about it then. So the Chrome Detention Center was created in the midst of that refugee crisis of 1980. And initially, Cubans and Haitians both occupied Chrome, but from the very beginning, there was this clear distinction. The Cubans were in the Chrome North, which was the sort of better established buildings, and the Haitians were in Chrome South, which was, it was dangerous to your health. It was mosquito infested and just the substandard housing. The Cubans, there's this group of Cubans, I should mention this, like several hundred that continue to be detained, and they become some of the most important challengers of the immigration detention system because they're this is a quick side note if you don't mind. They're people who committed crimes here, but the Cuban government wouldn't accept them back, so they're sort of people without a home or without a state. So they're some of the long-term detainees. But other than that, Cubans mostly get out of detention pretty quickly, and Haitians continue to occupy this. And pretty quickly after that refugee crisis of 1980, Chrome becomes just like the place to send Haitians. It's like overwhelmingly, almost completely for Haitians. They close it for a period, but then they reopen it. Not only are the conditions there terrible from the beginning, and they continue to be, it's the place of some of the just most shocking cases of abuse for all detainees, but especially for women. There were all kinds of just outrageous cases of sexual abuse by guards of detained women in Chrome Detention Center. And for Haitians everywhere, probably in Haiti and in the United States, but especially in South Florida, it's just this symbol of government abuse, and for good reason, right? Because not only is it a place that they send Haitians, but it's a place where Haitians are just abused and denigrated. And it's still a major detention facility. If those of you who were following Ravi Ragbir's case here, he was, when they arrested him here, but they sent him down to Chrome right away, and which was, for those of us who know about Chrome, that was sort of a startling collision of that this world and this world. And so so it like all other detention facilities, Chrome becomes a place that expands to encompass many more people than just Haitians, and all of them are also subjected to the same abuses. But it's most notorious for a Haitian detention facility, and it's the most notorious immigration prison in this country for sure.
Who operates the facility now? Or is it?
I think it's still government, but I'm not sure.
Is there any evidence, either anecdotal or otherwise, that the system was biased or favored lighter-skinned Cubans? As we know, Cubans are a much more racially diverse culture than Haitians, and so was there any kind of systematic, unwritten, policy that would weed them out?
Nothing that I've seen in the documents reflecting policy, but I think there's good reason to think that the reason that Cubans were really detained for the first time was 1980 and not before. And a big part of that, I think, not the only part, but a big part was, it was a different socioeconomic class of Cubans coming here in 1980 than many of those more affluent and lighter-skinned Cubans that had come earlier, right? So, and that goes back to the sort of local politics of South Florida. Non-Cuban South Floridians have had a complicated relationship to the Cuban community for a long time, but like, if you don't want poor black Haitians, you also don't want the many more poor black Cubans that were coming at the same time. And then there was this whole idea, some of which might be a little bit real, but a lot of it was concocted that, they were all criminals and people who were mentally unstable, and that Castro had emptied his jails, so-called. And so not only are they disproportionately more than their predecessors poor, dark-skinned, but they're more likely to be criminal. It sort of just fed this nativist, racist, xenophobic, class anxious moment. So I think that's a part where race enters the Cuban story. And then those people were detained, although never in the same way that Haitians were, and most of them, as I said, got out. But race enters there, but not ever nearly as much as for Haitians.
Are we allowed to ask questions about nowadays situation?
Of course. I may not know the answer, but...
And yes, first of all, we should also, I think, mention immigration, not just to South Florida and New York City, but also ongoing immigration to Puerto Rico, since there's short distance between islands, and there's still going on. And also nowadays situation with Haitians on TPS, temporary protection status, which will expire in summer 2019, and so there's no solution of what these people should do. Should they go back? Should they not? And there's another interesting situation I would like to know, and I hope you know that a lot of Haitians of people, Dominicans of Haitian descent was retroactively denationalized by Dominican Republic government, and those who were looking for asylum in the United States, they become stateless on American soil. What is the situation with them nowadays? What's the statistics? How many of them here?
You're saying if they were Dominicans of Haitian descent and then they were here, what's their
during that time? Yes.
Okay.
They were part of this migration process, and they faced the nationalization already here in the United States. What's their status?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that Haitians in the Dominican Republic have had to migrate back or go somewhere else, but I don't know how other receiving countries have regarded the erasure of their national status. I'd be kind of surprised if the United States or other, and I want to hear what you have to say, would all of a sudden just acknowledge the legitimacy of the Dominican Republic's, reversal. But more shocking things have happened by the United States government and others. So, yeah, can you answer?
Yeah, I can answer that.
Cool.
The answer of the United States government is that the Haitian Constitution says that any kid born to Haitian parents anywhere in the world is a Haitian kid. And they tell them, the same way that the Dominican Republic tell them, you're not stateless, go to Haiti, get your papers, birth certificate, whatever, and then you have a state. But then the Haitian state, when they go, they say, no, you're not from here, you got no papers here, go to Dominican or go to United States.
Okay.
Because there is there's a lot of corruption with issuance of papers. But the Haitian Constitution says that any kid born anywhere in the world, since the foundation of the Haiti Republic, is a Haitian citizen. Changing the topic, did you research anything about something called the cooler, or like a letter where they put the arrested people in this freezing condition to break your spirits, so you sign whatever papers and you get quickly sent away? That's like a strategy in immigration detention centers all over the United States. By the private, I don't know if it's done by the government and the private, but the detention complex. Did you research?
You're saying in terms of cold conditions by climate or
They have
actual?
no, they have like kennels.
Yeah.
Where they put you, huge kennels, where they put you like, while they process you. They call them the cooler, the ice coolers or the coolers. And they distribute a lot of these thermal plastic blankets. And people freeze there. Like they raise the air conditioner on purpose to make you sign papers, so you just get out of that, that hell. And they call it the cooler. I have read a lot about that on abuses.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. My understanding is most of that is happening along the border with where they catch people on the border and then they want them to sign papers quickly and go back. So it doesn't affect asylum seekers as much, although they will use it to try to keep you from pursuing an asylum claim. But so there's special holding centers that you can only hold people for up to 72 hours. And that's actually separate from, like, if they can't send you back within 72 hours, then they have to put you in a different facility. But it's the up to 72 hours facilities that are the hieleras, the ice boxes, where they freeze people as an intentional torture strategy to get them to sign. Absolutely. But I don't think it affects that well, except that you have a lot of Haitians now
Crossing the U.S.-Mexico border.
So it's affecting, Haitians as well as people from other countries, because a lot of people are coming across the border. But I also wanted to just speak to what the question over there about racism. I'm sure you know about the Civiletti, the Haitian refugee centers versus Civiletti. So this was a case in 1980, I believe, that a federal judge in Florida ruled that it was racism. And the language of this decision is brilliant. It's actually well worth just reading the decision, which is also available online. It is very strong language, and basically the judge said that, because they contrasted a policy at that moment for Cubans and a policy for Haitians, where the Cubans were expedited through an asylum process and the Haitians were expedited through a deportation process. And the ruling, the judge basically said, yes, this is absolutely racism. And it's actually, there's a ton of interesting detail in there too about things that the US government did to claim that there were no political issues in Haiti. This was during the 70s, right? This case, the decision was 1980. And so they sent these State Department people to Haiti to investigate, and say, oh, people who are getting sent back are not getting attacked or tortured, right? And they did it in this way that put all these people at risk. Like they would interview people who had been deported in the presence of the Tonton Macu, the paramilitaries, and who would then go and kill them after being interviewed. It's crazy stuff in that. It's really well worth reading. Sorry.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I've read that State Department report, and definitely the talk about the Civiletti case a lot in the book. And just back to your point, as I don't know that much about those deterrent practices, but I do know that I thought you were talking about something else. So early on, and a big thing that's in the book that I didn't talk about here is just all of the sort of grassroots resistance, including all the protests and rebellion within all the detention facilities, including at Chrome, where they sometimes had just not only rebellions, they broke out, and sometimes community members broke in, and it's just this constant rebellion inside detention centers and prisons. So that's, I think, a very inspiring part of the story too. But so one thing that they would do is send Haitians way up north during the wintertime. And they did, it was it's clear from the documents, they're well, this is one of the main sort of ringleaders of the protests at Chrome. Let's send him up way upstate New York. And of course, part of it is they're not going to be able to deal with the cold conditions, especially when the facilities aren't well equipped with heat and all this sort of stuff. So that's kind of related to what you're talking about.
How about the Cubans that are coming through the Mexican border nowadays because they don't have the wet food, dry food?
Right.
I have read about some of them they have come through South America all the way through Mexico. And how is their processing once they make it to the States?
The Cubans or the Haitians?
No,
Because the Haitians,
Cubans coming now because they can no longer, come like they used to after Obama changed the law. So I have read about families of Cuban people that have gone through very harrowing trips through South America all the way through Mexico, and they have made it to this side, and they apply for asylum. I guess it's economic asylum that the U.S. government doesn't look at Cuba with their policy now as political asylum. Did you look into that?
I don't know that much about the current treatment of the Cuban asylum seekers. Yes.
Maybe this is a bit too specific, but I was curious to find out, like in the detention centers, what are the facilities for pregnant women and what really happens with newborns? Do you have any?
I mean, they did, sometimes they would allow for the release of children and women, but they also, before it was well known to have like child and family, now we know that's a thing. They were doing those things with Haitians too. They would usually separate them, but not always, right? Like sometimes they, investigators would go into the like Broward County and Dade County jails and just find like kids, just like children. Like there was this famous case of like an 8-year-old girl named Rosalie Dorsonville, and she was just like in there with like men and adults. She had been in this jail for like 2 weeks, and this priest, Father Jean Just, like found her there, and it's like, so it's totally inconsistent, right? But they would from what I know and remember, sometimes allow for either the release of families and children, and sometimes they would have like family and child separate facilities and detention centers.
Any idea about the current like situation?
Well, I mean, now they have whole family, like in Dilley, I think, Texas is one of the major ones.
Although that stopped for a while too because of protests. Right. People managed to stop family detention and then they brought it back.
Right. So now I think it definitely children and families have their own separate detention facilities, which doesn't necessarily mean it's better, but at least they're not being put in like jails and federal prisons with other, people who aren't even immigration detainees. Which is what they were doing throughout this whole period. They were detaining people next to people who might or might not have been dangerous and might or might not have been actually convicted of real, but it was like throw them in there and treat them exactly the same, which again is not the way the law was supposed to be working.
Sorry, just like one follow-up. So the kids who would be born in these detention centers, they would be U.S. citizens, right? So what next? Like, if the asylum is denied or eventually they're going to be deported. So, I mean, I was just like curious historically or even like present for someone.
Well, if they're born, the United States, like other nations, tries to maintain this legal fiction of, even if you come into the country, if you don't like formally declare yourself and you're stopped before you get here and immediately put into detention, you're not yet formally entered legally according to the law. That doesn't make any sense, obviously, because you've crossed the border and you're here, but they're still able to apply that liminal status to the parents. But as far as I know, that they couldn't deny the fact that that child was born inside the United States, and of course then is the United States citizen.
Another situation that I have come across, my church is a member of the New Sanctuary Coalition. Partner was a family parents were from Senegal, that they often will deport the breadwinner of the family. And then we, the taxpayers, provide the support for all the rest of the 6 kids or whatever in public shelter apartments, which they cannot live in permanently. They have to be moved practically in the middle of the night, and another one, and yet another one, and yet another one. So it's one of the ironies of the system.
Yeah.
I wanted to invite anyone here who would like to go into a detention center and visit, as I was in Elizabeth, New Jersey. There are 2 groups that you can Google. One is First Friends, which is based in New Jersey, and the other is Sojourners, which is based at the Riverside Church. And you don't have to be affiliated with these groups. These have opportunities for you to be part of an accompaniment movement sometimes we actually organize and we get people out. It can be done. And certainly if you have an interest in this, you may want to experience a hands-on, your own views. If you see the movie The Visitor, the producer of that was a member of the Sojourners volunteer program. Richard Jenkins is a lead in that.
Thanks for that. Yeah, definitely. I want to add my support and endorsement of. I know First Friends better than Sojourners, but like definitely that's important work.
Also, just to your point about children in detention, a lot of the time, I know especially along the southern border, there aren't family detention centers where the parent is a male. So if a father comes in with a child and they separate them and process them separately because they don't technically have the institutions. All the family detention centers are for women and children. And along with that, specifically the conditions for children within the prisons, I went to a panel and they were speaking about how the education system set up for detention centers had a curriculum for 2 weeks. And there was one in New York where everything was done in Spanish because they assumed that the asylum seekers would be Spanish speakers. And there was someone from Senegal who learned Spanish while in detention for 2 years because they repeated the same lesson, the 2-week curriculum, again and again in Spanish. So he learned Spanish in detention. And so
in the United States.
In the United States, in upstate New York. And so not only is a lot of it's systemically absurd and the conditions are horrific, but the way children are processed through it and the way they respond to these issues are not only inhumane, but not equipped for long term either.
So the first group back in the early 70s that were deported back to Haiti, that had left the Beliers and stuff, were they murdered? What happened to them? Does anyone know?
I don't know. You mean that very first?
Yeah.
I don't know if we know someone knows for sure, but I don't know what happened to them.
Okay, can I ask a question? I'm curious if you can speak to the extent to which like public health plays into some of these issues, because my understanding, and I'm not familiar with the history, but my understanding was that certain Haitians were segmented out of the broader population because of HIV status and put into Guantanamo. And I'm wondering, does that continue to be a thing? And what was that about?
Yeah, so that's another like major chapter of the Guantanamo detention camp of the 1990s. So, and they were actually the ones that were last held while Haitians were held in Guantanamo because they were HIV positive. They had won legal victories so as not to be sent back to Haiti, but they were barred from entering the United States because for a while, and if anyone knows what the current status is of this law, I'd like to.
It was just overturned a couple of years
Yeah,
ago.
okay.
Actually.
So for then and for a long time afterwards, there was a law that said, migrants or refugees, even legitimate refugees, if they have HIV, they can't enter this country.
Visitors.
Okay, yeah.
It barred anyone with HIV.
And so what this is like this whole group of Haitian refugees who are HIV positive who just like are there in limbo, and they called it like carceral quarantine, and so and they too like start to do some of the most radical and militant protests and
That's what the Michael Ratner
right,
was
exactly.
about, that particular group.
Yeah.
That particular moment.
So it's like it's that in that case the sort of fears of the public health dangers and the contamination of Haitian refugees was literal, but it's an interesting way of thinking about it because like public health is always used sort of like explicitly or more like implicitly as like that's part of why we don't want them here because they're poor, they're diseased, and even like in the 1970s. There was a big like tuberculosis scare in Florida, and people were like, well, it's it's the Haitians, and there was just a huge amount of discrimination and violence even against them. So that's a really interesting chapter where like they're trying to negotiate the law and maybe legitimate public health concerns. Although like a lot of people pointed out that like there's no reason to think that allowing them to enter the country would cause a public health crisis, but. They actually were diagnosed with a communicable disease in that circumstance, but it relates to the larger sort of notion of Haitian and third world people dangerously contaminating our society and stuff like that.
I have one other question. At the risk of like sucking the oxygen out of the conversation, I will utter the T word, Donald Trump. And I'm wondering, like, so on the one hand, you had Barack Obama, who, if I'm not mistaken, sort of deported more people generally than any other president in modern American or just American history. But on the other hand, my understanding was that Obama was making or signaling that there were going to be efforts to begin to roll back private detention centers and sort of dismantle that system. And now we have the current president who seems to be deporting fewer people. And I'm wondering about this question about private prisons and where are we on that front? And what do you, to the extent that you can speculate or that you have a sense or a feel for what's may likely be happening, where are we going with respect to private prisons and detention centers?
So first, just to the Obama-Trump thing, I mean, like with many things when we compare Obama and Trump, I think, we don't recognize that the current detention system grew so drastically, first under George W. Bush and then under Obama. What Trump's doing mostly is just a continuation of the Obama administration's detention and deportation policies. In fact, you pointed out how he hasn't been able to deport as many people as Obama did. But the one place that might have been different, at least it was sort of going in this direction towards the end of the Obama administration, was the Obama administration reversed or sort of changed its rule, and it was withdrawing government support for private prisons, not immigration detention facilities, but for private prisons. And of course, many of us who don't think that for-profit prisons should exist, that was a victory and we were excited about that. And then immediately immigration activists and detention activists said, okay, so like private detention is a major thing in immigration detention or private prisons. And so like that's next. And they were sort of maybe cautiously hopeful that signaled we were going to get rid of not immigration detention entirely, but at least some of the most abusive and least accountable aspects of the detention system. Trump's elected. I don't really think we knew exactly where Hillary stood on that, but we know she wasn't elected. So Trump's elected. Immediately he changes that and just publicly endorses for-profit private prisons. And you should see the stocks in private prisons just went like through the roof right after Trump was elected, and that was for good reason. I don't think there's no reason at all, especially if Trump's able to arrest, detain, and deport as many people as he says he wants to, and as his supporters would like him to do, then that's only going to keep getting worse, I think. And he's opened up a lot of there have been new private prisons open, so it's definitely going in the opposite direction.
You know that the aggression on the part of the ICE officers has increased.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going, they used to go into buses on the border. They go into any public transportation and they will check IDs and grab people. You know that there were 50 public defenders in the Bronx who 2 weeks ago walked out of the court because we are not supposed to be giving any support. This is a sanctuary city. We're not supposed to be giving any support to ICE officers to pick people up. I have a personal friend who's a public defender in Brooklyn. She said when they have an immigrant, they will put them on a bus to go to Rikers to get them away from the ICE. This is a very difficult time. It's frightening. They are known as the Gestapo. That's their nickname.
Yeah.
I just heard today on public radio a segment WNYC about what is going on. There are more large arrests by ICE, fewer deportations. The rationale is that we are building a mass detention system all over the states, warehousing immigrants, but not deporting them for God knows what purposes. I mean, that's the rationale that the deportations are not being done as smooth as the administration thought it was going to be, but they are warehousing people and against violating all kind of rights, and that's what I heard today segment on a report, because they are investigating why ICE claims that they are doing what they call at large, just picking up people, looking for somebody, but finding 10 others that meet the criteria, taking them, but where are the deportations to show?
What's going on at 7-Eleven across the country? I'm sure you're aware of that, right? You heard that in the news. They're going in and making sweeps. It's horrible. Unions are standing up for immigrants. And there are many people who are being picked up off the street and deported. People who used to check in like Jean-Marguerite, a Haitian, who has a pending case and will be brought back.
Yeah.
However, and I don't know if this is too much off topic,
Okay.
but I was thinking you were mentioning the detention at Guantanamo, but also they were sending refugees to both back to Haiti, but also to other countries or tried. So I'm doing work on European immigration or legislation, and they kind of pick up people on the Mediterranean and send them back to Libya. So I guess my question is like, was there any control of what happened to people that they sent back? Because I know that European Union don't do that; they just send them back and like go on.
You mean, do they monitor?
Yeah.
whether
Was there any concern what would happen to the people that they sent elsewhere?
I don't think so. No. No, not. I mean, I have never found any evidence that there's any mechanism to even try to, which is a pretty strong evidence that they don't care to know. You know what I mean? So, no, I don't think so. I mean, other non-governmental groups, especially in times of like the coup and other dangerous times, which in Haiti has been a lot of dangerous times, but like they've sometimes worked to go and interview people and to monitor and track down people, and so we have some evidence from that. But the government, I don't think has paid much attention to that. I mean, sometimes it's just a matter of politics, right? Like if there's a big political campaign and, grassroots and the legal stuff, and if they can get some of that evidence into the legal proceedings, yeah, sometimes it can be
It's been
effective.
really hard for people to track what happens to the people who are deported. There was an article that came out recently that dealt with that, and the beginning of the article made it sound like they did this sort of systematic research and found all these cases, but then it ended up being sort of just describing like one or two cases. So I don't know whether they were actually able to figure out what happened to a lot of people. That was mostly around Central America. But.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but like there's that article recently in the New Yorker, and it's she worked with the Columbia journalist students, and other people. I'm forgetting some of the scholarly names. Now, scholars have worked on this, and they have looked at what's happened to the people sent back. But that was a good example, and you can like learn the methodology, and seems like one of the best studies to know what happens and track people. But the government, that's not the government, It's like so.
I just want to mention just recent case about deportation when one of the stateless people in the United States who was caught by ICE was sent back to Sierra Leone. However, his embassy of his ex-country could not confirm his nationality, and this person did not belong to that country. No matter what, this person was sent back under these terrible circumstances, and no one knows. He was separated from his wife and from his relative, and just was sent back. It was completely human rights violation. And the situation is worse that during new president administration, where this old Muslim ban came from, countries continue to accept undocumented immigrants, even if they not have right to do that, just because they're afraid that they will be added to that list, because they're afraid that their elites could not get visa to United States anymore. Their children who go to universities, and that's actually was one of the purpose of this ban thing.
Last comment, because it's getting late, and so it's.
It's really wonderful that you're here. But I wanted to ask you, or anybody, if you could comment on what's going on in Israel. They're attempting to deport the African.
Right. I don't know that much more about it, but Israel is one of these states that I mentioned that have a more recently developed immigration detention system. There's these African migrants there who refuse to voluntarily leave, and so they're keeping them in detention there. That's about all I know about it, but it seems like a pretty tragic.
It sounded like they were given an option to go to some countries that they didn't feel that they would be given a safe passage.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming out, and thank you, Carl, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.